We might try to resolve rather. It's not even decided that we want to resolve them.
So just for info, this, sorry, I'm putting the user stories. That's a short one that we just started. So there's not much on it. There's another one, just so you have perspective, with tons of user stories, but we, yeah.
They weren't quite in the right format, right? Or the
yeah, we're trying to be more formal about using a proper format in the new sheet. And that's why we're starting not quite from scratch. But yeah, I think going through what we each see as the basic issues to be solved is worth going through a round of what we see as our key basic issues.
And to give context, this is all about like a collaborative argument mapping system, kind of, and user stories for that. Yeah.
Or even determining what argument mapping is. Because it's interesting. I think all of us, we share the same goal, but there's many different ways of going about it, and there's many different ways of interpreting what argument mapping is, and how formal or informal that has to be. Because I read your blog, Jonathan, and I mean, yeah, you go even less formal, right? You have a comment, and it doesn't matter what the comment says. It's just like, do people express any interest in that comment or not, and then that determines by the system whether or not there's a need for follow-up. So you don't even identify a claim per se, as the way I understood it in your blog. So we're all coming from different angles, and it's like trying to figure out what do we share, and can we maybe build a shared subset. And I think, as Bentley outlined last meeting, at this stage we don't even necessarily aim to have a shared system in a way of a like code we share, but at the very least it's an interesting discussion to see conceptually where we stand.
Yeah, by the way, I apologize. I've read only and surfaced what you wrote because I became aware of it in the middle of another reunion I was in, another meeting I was in the past hour. It's like, so I had to read in diagonal. Apologies for that. One of my goals for spending all this time with everybody here is that we can have a shared data format and a shared, I often speak of shared protocol for exchanging concepts. And when I say concepts, I'm generic in a sense, like there's the claims, there's the arguments, weaving the claim together and establishing connection between claims, but there's the entities, which are parts of the claim. And the big question for me in there is identity. When are two claims the same claim? And they could be letter by letter identical and not be the same claim, because there are a lot of contextual cues about what the claim means. And what do we mean by meaning? So for me, that's part of the really hard, this whole, what does the claim imply? What does it entail, and so on. But the aim is to have a kind of mapping of, there's this claim, here are all the other ways to look at this thing. This is what we agree on. This is what we don't agree on. This is the map of viewpoints, so that we can start comparing and eventually hopefully harmonize, find connections between viewpoints. That's my aim. But yeah, the whole notion of what is a claim and when are two claims actually different, and how do you establish a distinction between claims? So I'm very much looking at, and again,
or does the system even need to represent claims? Is that what, like, for example, like I just said, in what Jonathan envisions, I wouldn't call those claims. So then maybe there's no need for what Jonathan envisions to share any common data format with what you intend.
Yeah,
that's some of the struggles that we're trying to figure out. Like, even though we're talking like about the same thing, it's very hard to determine what the common denominator is and whether or not it's useful to have some common infrastructure to support it.
You talked about progressive enhancement yesterday. Yes. I feel like the next obvious enhancement of what I've described, one of the next obvious enhancements is to be able to carve out a claim. For example, one of the things I thought is, what if you, could agree, disagree, but you could, instead when you click the thumbs down button, you have two options, agree or disagree, but, or agree, but, which is sort of a way of implying that you agree with the statement that was made, but you don't think that it supports whatever you're responding to. So just to give you an idea of, I think there might be, and I think once you can do that once you start making those enhancements, you start to get all the benefits, I think, that we're all trying to look for with more formalized structured arguments.
The way I personally want to handle this one is I make a huge distinction between the support and claim and its ability to be a support. That's something that Stephen and Tim call relevance. For me, and it's what I call an argument. Like the argument is, there is this argument that this claim supports this other claim, and you can agree with the premise without agreeing with the argument, saying, no, it's true, but it doesn't support this, and make those totally independent.
And people can go off and they can be debating that claim. And you can benefit from debates about that claim that have happened somewhere else.
Because it may be relevant to something else, which is entirely fine.
So I was also thinking in like the deliberative poll, you could just embed a claim into an argument. You could just drop a URL, like when you drop a link to an external document, a URL is just the same. And it would do maybe a little Twitter card showing a summary of that argument and some statistics. But now you have that structure that this is one of the premises of my argument.
This is one basic goal for Tim. It's like the idea is to centralize, to have, like, there's a place where you can go to know what's the universe of discourse around a certain claim. So you can have this URL, this is the identity of this claim, and this is all its neighborhood. And yes, that's a goal for me too, except I'm more, let's have federation rather than centralization, but it doesn't matter. That's a technical difference. The basic idea is there has to be a way to obtain the neighborhood of a claim. And there's many kinds of neighborhood. That's the difficulty. We're looking at, for example, like more specialized or more generic claims. That's one kind of neighborhood. All that it supports or opposes, that's another kind of neighborhood. How do you know this is another kind of neighborhood?
Where is it being used?
Where is it being used? If it's, and some claims are about the state of the world, but some claim about it would be good to do this. Okay, then what is the goal? Why is it good? How is it good? What are the criteria? Because those are also claims.
Yeah.
Value claims. But yeah, one thing I started to say is I keep speaking about claims because that's one of the things we have in common. But for me, claims is not the key concept. Concept is the key concept, of which we have entities and claims which are built of entities and arguments.
Your background makes sense here, Marc-Antoine, because I mean, in a way, you're more interested in building
a knowledge graph.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean,
yeah, no, but that's part of the things we don't.
I understand that in a knowledge graph, the main concept that is of relevance is the entity, obviously.
Yeah.
But is it the main entity in an argument support in argument technology? Is the main entity really an entity? And I would argue no.
And my claim all along, and it's a claim, has been that it's through the underlying component entities that we distinguish or identify claims.
But this highlights a core problem we've been having, which is also why I suggested the more user story driven analysis to see where we overlap or not and which entities are involved in these user stories, because I think it is impossible. I truly believe it is impossible to support all of these use cases in one system and make one model to support that one system. I think that's a lost cause. I think Marc-Antoine believes more that is the goal even.
Correct.
So I'm trying to uncover how many different systems are we actually talking about here, and is there a common subset of all of those systems that we can maybe have a shared data format for. That's what I'm trying to uncover.
And just to make a distinction clear, I believe it is possible and desirable to have a common data format to those systems. I don't believe there's going to be one UX or one system in that way, because the UX are use case specific. But I do believe there can be an underlying data format for all those UXs. And that's something that Stephen believes might be impossible. That's part of what we're trying to.
Well, impossible.
Those are the open problems
or undesirable from a software engineering perspective. But yeah, so this indeed, I think that's probably the main problem. I would bring that forward as the main problem that we've been facing in these discussions. Problem of scope, you could call it.
Yes.
So I've been reading about the Dung argumentation framework, because I still don't understand it. You mentioned it in your paper, Stephen, and I found a great...
I wrote that paper many years ago, so I'm also a bit cloudy on that, but I think Marc-Antoine knows it better than I do. I know.
Who does?
Marc-Antoine?
I used to know it. I should recheck, but what I understood, it was pretty simple, really. It's just,
simple,
you know.
It is. Maybe ask a question, then we can see.
So and maybe I'm just going to quote this because I'm having trouble pasting. So in order to facilitate common platform for exchange across systems, unified formalism for the different approaches to knowledge representation are required. This was the motivation for Dung to propose his paper. An approach later became known as abstract argumentation framework. Roughly speaking, Dung's arguments are abstract entities which are related to each other by the means of conflicts between them. And a framework postulated this way is, on the one hand, too general to be used on its own, but on the other hand, it is general enough to allow for varied extensions, increasing its expressiveness, which indeed have been proposed. So an argumentation framework is lossy, right? All you do is say, here's the conflicts between these entities, but you can at least do something with that, I guess, is the idea.
I
think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I'm just curious, and for me, it's, on the one hand, I agree. On the other hand, I disagree. Okay, let me get into that. I think that the idea of looking at the opposing statements as fundamental is perfectly valid on the one hand, and in a way, it's what Bentley's doing, right? He's Bentley's Gullybot assumes a statement is true until opposed.
Yep.
And I think it's fine. And then you have a position of the opposition, and then the statement. I think I'm interested in distinguishing. When I said I want my truth value to be 2 axes instead of 1, that's why I want support independently. If something is just opposed, okay, yes, let's assume it's true. But if it's opposed and supported, then it's contentious. And I find that more an interesting separate case. And there's no way to do that in Dung. You cannot say this statement has both. There's both reasons to believe and reasons to disbelieve that. So it's problematic. Yeah. And for me, that's a useful status, which is missing in Dung. But he's looking, he calls them arguments, but he's looking at claims, and really the arrows are arguments in my vocabulary. It's the connection between claims.
Yeah, in the CDL terminology as well,
yeah. I don't think a Dung argument doesn't have to be a claim. You know, it can be it can be very, very abstract. It's just basically anything that contradicts anything else. I even thought, for example, a Dung attack could be, you know, you say something and I say, why? Or give me an example. And those are attacks that you have to either accept or...
Yeah, I say, give me an example. It can be, or it can not be an attack. I see what you're saying. It's a questioning, and it's valid. You could say, I don't believe it until you give me an example. That could be an attack.
Right. I guess it implies maybe a claim, right? Like, give me an example implies there aren't good examples, or I doubt that there are good examples.
Or not, right? I mean, it could be an exam question. Give me an example of this
Yeah,
definition.
or there's ambiguity there, but
yeah, but which is fine. I mean, but I think both cases need to be, or maybe it's not important. Well, anyway, I was saying there is a notion of I think supporting is distinct from attacking, and Dung doesn't have support, and that's a problem. But he's dealing.
That's a common criticism, I think, and a lot of people have extended the Dung framework to allow, you know, as sort of a first class part of the framework, support as well as oppose.
Yeah, and he doesn't have negation, but my main problem is that he's looking at the relationship between claims and not between entities, and often the relationship between claims can be like the notion is generalizable. You can have mutually exclusive definitions of an entity, and that's a useful concept when you're trying to analyze claims. Like, how is this claim different from this one? How is this claim attacking this one? It's because, well, it's using this different definition and there's no overlap, blah, 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 blah. So you can use that as a way to infer something at the claim level.
Yep.
And it feels sad not to use that generalization when it's trivial. Well, not trivial, but fairly obvious generalization. But again, I'm a mathematician. That's my standpoint is anything that can be generalized should.
I think that, you know, a Dung framework is lossy, right? It can't represent the information that a lot of information about the structure. I think people call it the internal structure.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and basically as a base class, it's pretty close to the entity diagram. Felix sent me an entity diagram that's pretty close, right? It's very, very, very simple. All this other.
Do realize we don't have agreement on the entity diagrams, so it's very primitive because it's only the parts we could agree on, which is a tiny subset of what we all want. Yeah.
Well, and it also, because even though we agree on incremental or progressive formalization, we never really talked about how to model that, right? Because you, Mark and Tom, probably want, again, one model to represent all the different forms from less to more formalized, whereas I would almost go as far as to say, well, the more formalized version is a different model than the less formal version. And they're linked somehow.
No, I bought that argument, Stephen. I did not. I bought that argument.
Because then in that case, it's true, right? That the Dung framework might be the least formal one, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Let me qualify a bit. I bought the argument that at an ecosystem level, we need to have a plug and play formalization. However, to achieve Tim's goal of disambiguation, disambiguation can only be done through a unifying formalization. That doesn't mean other formalizations can exist, but then we need translation levels. But so that the disambiguation can be done within something. Now, it's entirely possible that it's enough to have the distinction as a base level entity concept. And then
which we didn't add yet, by the way, I think, right? No, what? We didn't add that one yet, right? Because I think we do agree on that one, but we never added it to the model in any way.
I think it's really worth doing, because if the distinction is fundamental, then different formalizations could affirm different distinctions, and yet they would all understand the distinctions. And I like that. Like, global unification is only possible with a single model, and I think that's a goal. And having a good model is, for me, a goal for that reason. But having multiple formalizations is also a goal, because I don't believe in one model to rule them all in general. But the notion of distinction being shareable between formalizations, I think, would be brilliant. It's certainly a base layer, fundamental base layer entity. So these are the kind of conversations we're having, Jonathan.
Yeah, these are fascinating conversations. I don't think I know what the distinction is as you've defined it?
It's like, how do you, how can you tell whether or not a claim written one way is the same than a claim written in another way? For like, are we talking about the same thing? Are we referring to the same entities, which is why Michael one thinks it's so important to formalize entities? Like Paris is a great city. Yeah,
Fair.
which Paris,
Yeah.
Texas Paris, etc. So these types of things we're talking about.
Or Paris is great, and then it's like Paris mythological or Paris Hilton, or you know.
Yeah, you can't just only go by the textual representation from where it's being mentioned. You need more information to be able to know whether or not a claim is.
In a lot of Unix documentation, you see when you're reading a document, a word, you know, that's ambiguous, you know, ACT or something, and there'll be a little parentheses to by it, which means definition to, and it links to a definition.
That's also why we do share this common notion that definitions play a key part in disambiguation, and you need to be able to attach definitions to words used in claims. So in that sense, we have a lot of agreement. In the sense of how to accomplish that, it's an ongoing discussion.
So, hey, Jonathan, you said in parentheses to and stuff like that after the word. Are you referring to that as a footnote?
No, not in man pages. The parentheses indicates one of many definitions, and it represents a link to it, like a definition of that function.
Okay, because one of the side projects that might be helpful in this is I bought term.fyi, where I want to have a standard set of, you know, of definitions, disambiguated definitions of words. So then it would link to term.fyi / the word / one.
Yeah.
And then that would be kind of a central place to keep all that. Anyways, I wasn't, I hadn't seen that. I hadn't seen done exactly the way that you mentioned. So I just want to clarify what you were thinking.
So that reminds me of maybe a user story. Is sometimes I say something or somebody says something, and the reality is half of what I say, I don't actually have a very, very precise meaning for my words in mind. And I hope that the particular nuance of the word I'm saying is the one that will be translated to your brain. And I don't know in advance that that's going to be a point of ambiguity. But once I do, I want to clarify. And so what I thought, and sometimes I made a mistake on, like, that was really the wrong word. And I think a potential user story, and I don't know if it fits, you know, like the base layer, but to be able to retract or restate. Yeah, most of what I said, I would stand by, but I didn't say it right. And so what I'm really saying, or what really clarifies at least what I'm saying, is this. And then I add maybe some links to definitions. And
I think that interpretation is a fundamental relationship. You have a statement made in context that is, it's just a statement, and it's indexical of a vague concept in your brain. And you often only clarify when you realize you have to clarify it, which may be much later. But somebody has an interpretation that is, and of course, the interpretation is to a concept which only exists in wetware, but what you do often is restate. And even if I'm interpreting your statement, I'll say, oh, I think what you mean is this. Or you can, as you point out, restate yourself. It's something you can reinterpret. When I said this, I really meant that. and that's a new statement, which can itself be reinterpreted. But the notion is that, on the one hand, concepts and statements are in many-to-many relationship, right? There's a statement can have multiple interpretations, like wetware interpretations, and same concept may be expressed in many different ways. But the interpretation, like the symbol to symbol interpretation link, the restatement link, I think is the one, because we never have access to wetware concepts. And I used to think, oh, maybe we can represent this, but no, let's not represent this, but let's have it's kind of the limit of the reformulation towards more precise and more context independent. And that's a relation, and it's aiming at asymptotically a perfectly well-defined concept, but it's asymptotic. We never reach it. But what we have is a chain of refinements, and the tail of the chain at any one moment is what we can use as a proxy to the wetware concept.
Yeah, that's a good mental model.
I was wondering, is this whole concept of interpretation and specialization isomorphic to distinctions?
No, though it is related. I was wondering, can I express distinction as this? I think distinction is the same as support and oppose. They're two, we need both ends. The distinction is saying this refinement is distinct from this one because this is true of this refinement and not of that one. You have to identify a distinguishing characteristic.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So you have to say, so you say this is a valid reinterpretation of that, and this is not a valid reinterpretation of that because this is true of this one and not of that one. And that's what I call a distinction, really. So explicit absence of distinction could be the same as interpretation, but I think you need both. But certainly, I think you can do a lot of lineage from those two. And yet it's like support oppose, but at a totally different layer. And I think this is fundamental to concept definition.
Okay, so so they're different concepts, distinction and reinterpretation, but could restatement handle both? So you say something and you use a word that has two interpretations, and then you restate it with, the parens next to the word or a link to the definition of the word.
Yeah.
And then someone else restates it with a different definition of the word.
Yes. But you still have to somehow say that those two are distinct. You have to say, oh, by the way, those two are distinct because those two words happen to be different. So you have to make that statement.
Right. If you do formalize the definition by linking the word to a definition, and otherwise it's the same, then you can deduce that they're distinct. The system can say, well, they're clearly distinct.
No, because you don't know that they're distinct until they're stated to be distinct. I'm very much open versus closed world. I don't believe that the absent of statement is a statement of absence. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Yep. But there's a question, is the same statement using two distinct words?
You don't know these two words are distinct until it's stated.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that you can state, a restatement or even an initial statement can involve a very explicit clarification of a very specific version of the word that you're using. And so once you have the identical statement with just two different versions of the word linked.
Okay, well, but here you're presupposing that the two distinct versions of the word linked were stated to be distinct in the first place. It's that distinction that you use to buttress the statement distinction, which is exactly, I totally believe in that. I believe in using entity distinctions as a way to deduce claim distinction or statement distinction.
Yeah, it comes down to what is a definition. In the meantime, I think I added what you're saying, Jonathan, as a user story, because you mentioned this one and I agree this one. I don't know whether you've had time to read it. As a contributor, having added a claim before, I want to restate it with a definition for one of the concepts used therein, so that there's less room for ambiguity. Does it capture what you were saying?
Yeah, I think there's other related stories, but that is one, I think, clear story.
Yeah, I think he also had one where you actually contradict your earlier statement, because the restatement is a contradiction of the earlier statement.
Story, though.
But that's a different story.
So if you do the analysis here, it all boils down to what a definition is, essentially, or a concept even. And that's why it's useful to write these things. And then, indeed, do we agree on what a definition is? And we've had past discussions, and no, we do not agree necessarily on what a definition is. I've been playing around personally that a definition is nothing more than a claim. But yeah, what was it? Entity? No, concept.
There is certainly a claim element with definition, in the sense that you're claiming that this is an appropriate definition for this term, as opposed to a different definition. And you can be claiming that these two definitions are equivalent or non-equivalent, and that's a distinction angle. Or you can claim that this definition is clearer than that definition.
Well, the main reason I wanted it to be, why I wanted definitions to be claims was because there's discussion around definitions as well. That's even fairly common.
Yes.
And where do you go when there's disagreement on the definitions or the concepts used in the definitions?
Yeah.
Because definitions also use concepts.
But
you paint yourself in a well, how are you going to support those disagreements? So I rather have like a recursive system that just uses the original concepts to resolve disagreements. Hence,
what I'm trying to say is I want to make a distinction between the definition itself and the claim that this definition is a proper definition for this word. They're distinct things.
Yeah.
The intended definition in this particular context, or
either contextual or decontextualized.
Well, that's yet another. I mean, if somebody specifies a claim with a definition, there's no disagreement on that was the intent. Okay, there's another discussion that's interesting to mention, and it's the difference between contextualized claims and claims. Like one of the goals that Timothy and I want is we want to have claims to be we want to have claims we can interpret without having to know where they are being used.
Yeah,
the point is, sorry?
Global claims, like a Wikipedia of claims.
Yeah, exactly. You want to link to it. The whole point is to centralize the discussion on that claim. So you don't care about how somebody that points to that claim interprets that claim in the central system.
Claims or claim, you can only understand. Yeah.
So if it's ambiguous, it's ambiguous. If it's a bit more defined, it's a bit more defined, but both are valid use cases. As you described yourself before, you sometimes want to state a claim and you don't have an exact definition in mind. And well, through argumentation on that claim, you might find disagreement on definitions, and that's when you need to go to more precise claims that are better defined.
And I agree for the need for decontextualized claim, but I'm saying they're always built from contextual interpretation of contextual claims, because even the decontextualized claim defines its own context. I mean, again, that's asymptotic. We're trying to make it decontextualized, and we got to a certain point where it's sufficiently decontextualized to be usable as such. But it's always built out of this. Of course,
I also think contextualized claims are important, but the main point is they're different entities.
There, I agree totally with you.
So I've often thought that in an argument, let's say we're arguing about whether we want to hire some job candidate, and someone makes a claim, they did a great job on the coding test, and that claim could then appear in many different places under that argument tree. And so I think sometimes a claim kind of has a root context, and where anything in this tree, you can just throw that claim in and it'll make sense. But anything above that, it's not going to make sense. So and I wonder actually if you can infer that, because if somebody makes a top level claim, like the first argument they make is this candidate aced the coding test, right? And then somebody else makes the argument, this candidate's not a good team fit. You could say, or this candidate, I don't like her shoes. You could respond, well, yeah, but she aced the coding test, right? And you can now link to that claim, and that's perfectly appropriate, right? Now you know exactly who it refers to. So I think if you walk up to a tree and like you find any like common uncle or great uncle, you can use that.
A great question there is, I mean, Tim would go for, let's avoid the context as well. No, he wants context as in, let's give all the relevant definitions. in the claim, so it can be stated decontextualized. But for me, context is a first-class object. Being able to say, we live in this context, this contextual claim lives in this context, so there's all these entity references, or even inference context, like something Jamie of Society Library has been introducing is the induced claim. And take dog whistles, right? Dog whistle is an innocuous claim that makes you think of a non-innocuous claim. So that's not contained. There's no deduction. There's no, it's all suggestions. It's all inference here. And it's the context that allows the inference to happen. Now, the question is, and that's a question we have not tackled that much given how important it is do we want to model context? I mean, since the main focus is on decontextualized claims, on the one hand, no, in that sense, right? Modeling context makes sense when you're modeling contextual claims. There is another notion of context, which is the definitions that everybody agrees on. But the notion of context as in this provenance, and what are the relationship between provenance? And that's a big black hole in my, I know there's something fundamental in understanding the relationship between contexts. Like this context is embedded in that context, so it can pull all those definitions from the embedding context and so on. Like we're speaking a bit like mental frames here. If this happened, like hypothetical situations, or there's this whole twist.
Well, it is indeed an opposing goal, right? If you always attach context, you no longer centralize, because each time someone states something as something is stated somewhere, it's a different claim. Or it's a different and I mean, because that's literally what it is, because that's context that's important to that needs to be modeled. So you want to omit context in order to centralize. Centralizing claims literally means trying to remove as much context as is irrelevant to the grander discussion you want to have and share with other people.
And for me, that's the interpretation process. Like I'd have explicit modeled context, and to show how the claim in context maps to, can be interpreted as
but where do you start?
Contextualized. Because I'm interested in going from the claim to all the context it's been in.
Yeah, but okay, let's talk through this in user story. So if every claim you add is first and foremost a contextualized claim, that means somebody adds a claim to the system. They say, well, I added it on my blog post here. This is the text, and at the very minimum, you need the source, which is a sort
yes,
type
correct.
of context.
Correct, provenance.
Like, and somebody else adds another claim and adds a different source. Like, how are you going to start linking these up? Like, how does the second person that wants to link to a claim? They don't want to be, it's not even the same claim. That would be a source citing yet another source, basically.
No, but that's the relationship between contextualized and decontextualized claim. The idea is the interpretation operation points from contextualized to decontextualized claim. And if we
I know how you want to model it, but how and when does the transformation happen? By which user action?
By the process of decontextualizing interpretation. I spoke of interpretation. The interpretation should go towards decontextualized claims, and that's what interpretation means. And well, it isn't. But okay, I'm making the point that decontextualization should be towards progressively decontextualized claims. And then you can travel the arrows backwards from.
But how and when does that happen? Like, what does a user do? What does a user see? And how and when does it happen?
Valid question. The user enters a contextual claim, says, okay, this is this claim made with this provenance. And I think what it means in context is, and then you paraphrase, and then you make it, you remove indexicality, as you've been saying, like if there's, pronouns or whatever, you determine the precise definition when appropriate. You basically interpret it and make it more and more context free. And that is the operation of making it decontextualize.
Okay, so you're saying that whenever a user adds a claim, they just don't, like Timothy and I would say that you don't only add decontextualize, you also always add the source.
Yes.
And then
I'm saying when you enter a claim, you're saying this is this claim in this context, and you try to decontextualize it, and you try to find a less contextual version. And at some point, what is great is if you have interpretation as a link, right? You'll be able to say, here is already a less contextualized version. And this one, you can follow the chain. This is more and more, less and less ambiguous interpretations until you find, oh, look, here is a common ambiguity that has to be resolved. Can I resolve it in this case? So yes, I know that in this context, it must have meant this usage of the word versus that usage of the word. Or maybe I cannot because it was unclear in context. So I will say in this case, this word is maintained in its ambiguous status. And somebody could take the same sentence in a different context, come with a different interpretation, or come with the same sentence in the same context and come with a different interpretation, because humans differ in how they read things.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I mean, the way I would intend to model, I have it somewhere on my backlog. Claims in context is indeed as I first and foremost one I support now is a decontextualized claim. But then you would add another claim like this source said that claim, which means the decontextualized claim basically. Oh, and that source wrote that, which refers to, which I call a claim by itself, which you call interpretation, I guess.
Yeah.
And that for me is simply the backlink from the decontextualized claims to all different sources that point to the same decontextualized claim.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think we agree we need to support both. It's
yeah.
Jonathan, bombarded?
No, I think I understand. I'm developing my mental model now.
Good.
Context. I think maybe one of the user stories, well, tell me if you think this is true, that we want, so sometimes there's a lot of context.
Yes.
So it might be a group that's been working together for a long time, or a blog post where there's a lot of the same posters and they
like
all
us,
have
yes.
a terminology, right? And then, and I think maybe one of the goals is to, and so your goal is to decontextualize as much as possible. So get a claim that's very, very global. But still those claims are usually going to still have context. It takes time to get, take away all the context. So for example, the context might be WikiFact or whatever, some place where, you fact checked statements made in the news, right? Or we take all those claims that society libraries pulled out of, from pundits, right? And you fact check that claim, and although that's very contextual. So what you try to do actually is link that to an even more context-free claim. The climate is warming, because of human activity, and the context is just this global fact check website that exists for no other reason than to post and discuss these claims outside of any other context than this is the global fact checked website, and then in context somebody makes a claim, and then you're going to try to you want to link to that claim. You don't want to link to that claim on some guy's blog post where there's a ton of context behind it. You prefer, especially if there's a lot of good discussion and other data, prefer to the one in that very global context.
That's absolutely true. I agree with that. You
still need to decontextualize, because even in that global context, we're going to be assuming things about people that go to that fact check website and what they mean by words, right? So there's still this process of clarification or distinction or restatement. But you want to at least maybe start with as little context as possible.
That's my view, at least. For me, the task is adding context where needed because it resolves disagreements.
Right.
Like so I go the opposite way. I want to become more and more contextualized if the discussion requires it.
And I think what we'd all like is at some point, someday, you'll be on a blog, you'll read a claim, and you'll be able to, highlight the claim and say, okay, what is the universe of supporting, opposing, and alternative views on this, and have a map of alternative viewpoints, and how well they're supported, and how well they're agreed upon, and are they fringe, are they blah, blah, blah.
And you want an automatic coloring.
That's the end game for it. What?
You want an automatic coloring of the blog post.
Yeah.
With stuff that's not true or that's generally accepted to be true.
Or controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that's the end goal.
Whose article is full of crap because they made all these statements that are totally.
Yeah, and you can see that on first glance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, I mean, for me, that's already a very second layer thing. I mean, it is what I'm prototyping right now, but it already requires a lot of curation on exactly what Michael Twain calls interpretation. You can't just take any text in an article. It doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of effort to turn text in articles into claims. It's not always the same text, right? Because arguments aren't written that way. So you basically, my first step is that the authors themselves, they add claims to their text. There's no room for disagreement at that point. They simply direct the link. The second step for me is to have some type of browser plugin where third-party users, I don't know, any visitors of websites can start annotating any website and start saying, I think this text here refers to that claim in the central claim database. And then there can be a creation process about that. No, that's not what they meant. And that's the whole interpretation thing. And that's why I think, again, that it is a claim in its own right to say that this source, by mentioning this text, implies that claim.
Yeah, yeah. Or you might want to, like often in social media, people will start an argument by saying, Tucker Carlson lied about X, or, Biden lied about X.
Mm-hmm.
And so that immediately breaks down to Biden said X.
Yes.
X is not true. Biden knew that X is not true. And so what's neat is Society Library, they pull out the claims. And so they give you a nice worded claim, but there's also the claim, implicit claim that this person said X. And so you already have kind of the structure of an argument to start with.
Yeah, that's also why I concluded my first user study of Socrates with saying the main problem is context. It's also why some of the first discussions I've had with CDL was about context and how do you model it and what is it. Bentley, maybe you want to share what you just posted in chat?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if everyone had heard about Fiskit yet. So we were kind of discussing taking an article and adding commentary. This definitely doesn't go into the level of detail that Stephen was asking for, but it goes kind of a little bit of the way. So click on like that first article there. So let's stick an article from another newspaper and then allows people to label different sentences. So maybe click that one and see what they're saying. Biased wording. So you see the little label there? It's a little hidden now than it used to be. So you're able to take each kind of sentence and add logical fallacies or what different ways of interpreting it. I talked to him about doing some sort of roll-up of all this stuff to where you can get an impression of the accuracy of the article, but that's not an area he was going to in at that time. But it was just interesting. There's a plugin for this as well that allows you to comment things. He looks like he's made some changes since he's done it. I really was thinking more of the labels than those generic comments that they have in there.
There's a bunch of people trying to do a kind of opinions over annotation. By the way, among the many conferences I should be at today, there's a annotate. There's the big annotate conference right now. And
I attended that yesterday, and I'm going to attend one tomorrow. A lot of them are about kind of annotation in education, so I'm skipping those, but
yeah, well, there's one right now that looks extremely interesting about precisely annotation and collective sense making. I'm so annoyed I cannot do it all, but I cannot. And but if you, for example, there's the people at the overlay. Now the people at the overlay, I'm still not convinced they're serious, but they certainly have this idea that you can have this overlay of annotation on the web that is kind of, you have a social layer, so you know, who do you trust to put annotation, and so they are interested in having a trust layer over the web through that.
What are they called?
But yeah,
What are they called? This project that you mentioned?
Overlay-tech.com. Oh no, is that the one? No. Sorry, it's not that one. It's another overlay. Apology. Google Complete led me astray.
yeah, I think the Annotate conference meeting right now is still, that one looks interesting, but they're still kind of focused on student learning.
Yeah, there's many reasons why you can annotate, right? The main distinction, what we're talking about, is really that you annotate claims, and ideally decontextualize claims, so you can centralize discussions across different sources. But you can also annotate to give feedback on a paper writing, or you can, I mean, there's so many reasons. Because there was the biggest one that I know of that did claim annotation was Hypothesis and Rebutter, I think.
Yeah, and Hypothesis is the one hosting this conference, by the way.
Oh,
yeah. Hypothesis is great. Memex is trying to do the same thing. Very interesting stuff. But yeah, and they're much more serious than Overlay. I said I'm not convinced Overlay is serious.
So yeah, I kind of envision us as building kind of that, backend's the wrong term, but you know what I mean, kind of the infrastructure that then this overlay technology would be built on, right?
Yeah, so anytime someone annotates something in Fisket, there is accessible the claims that have made, and the annotation is like, this statement is misleading, or this statement commits this fallacy, plus the statement itself. And then you could repurpose that. For example, I think a lot about social media. You can post that to social media, because that's, people always start with like news articles and stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Bridget. Yeah.
Leading, and what'd be great is social platforms pulled in all the discussion that even happened on these other platforms, and allowed you to comment, and your comments would show up in Fisket and these other platforms.
Yeah, adding the nuance I think that Steven's trying to bring up is that oftentimes they're not worded in the form of claims very well.
There's different contexts, right?
We take their quote, keep it in context, build it, and then progressively decontextualize.
Yeah. Well, but then you just have, if you don't decontextualize, my claim is that you have mass again. The whole point is that you should teach users to make it easy for them to decontextualize claims. Otherwise, there's no reuse. There's no claim reuse without decontextualization. So if you just imagine you have like global warming is fake, and you just have a contextualized list of everyone that ever said that, it's a useless list. It's the same as Google search results. That's not the point here.
Yeah, right. So having a decontextualized claim that then can point to multiple sources, saying we think these sources are making this claim.
I think for me, the point of having the source is also being able to, I understand that, I agree. Everybody who believes that, useless. But the source of the statement, and here was the original evidence, and here was the original support and oppose of this thing, that for me is useful. So, and especially in the context of a lot of social conversations are actually based in scientific conversation, and having a kind of social media for scientific claims is also relevant. What is the evidence for this? Anyway,
so
I
many
put
conversations.
links to the, oh, it's actually, I was wrong about overlay, it's over web, and I've got the link.
Many conversations happen in a forum, and that forum, I think, is part of what you mean by context. and everyone is assuming that other people in that forum have the same context. There's a certain common knowledge, and so when you link, you're linking conversations across platforms, that can be a problem, right? So if the conversation starts on Fiskit or in the comments of a blog, they start in the context which includes all the readers of this blog, and that the blog or CNN.com, that creates sort of a context where all the readers kind of have a certain assumptions about what the other readers know and believe, and at least what this article that they've all read says, and so then if somebody makes a claim about the article in the context of that article, that provides us, I think, a certain level of clarity. But you can share that, right? You can share the comment when you share it, for example, on social media. You share the article and then the comment, and immediately now you've kind of gone from your regular social media context to the context of this blog post. You see it. This is the blog post. This is something that somebody said about the blog post. Now you actually have the same context of everyone else that's participating.
I have to leave now. Bye-bye. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, making context explicit is a first step, but then you can't reuse it easily. And I think a nice example of that is Kialo. I mean, Kialo does pretty much what we want to do, but by default, claims are written in context. If you add a supporting claim to another claim, it implies that the conclusion you're targeting. So all of a sudden that supporting claim, if you refer to it from totally elsewhere, it might break, if you will, because that context is not formalized. So
I've got to go too. I've got a meeting at 6 here.
Well, this was interesting. Hope to see you next time, Jonathan.
Yeah,
nice to have your input. Friday, same time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have the calendar yet, Jonathan?
I don't. And Friday I'm going to be on a train traveling to the north of Spain, and probably can't make it unless I can get internet connection. But I think I can make the next meeting, if not Friday.
Yeah. Anyways, let me know how I can give you the calendar, if it should be a Google Calendar invite or you want the iCall link.
Calendar invite will work.
Okay, then just give me your Google email and I invite you.
Yep, I think you got mine actually. It's
all right. Okay. Yep. Great.
See you.
See you. Bye.